Good evening and welcome to the Purcell Room. I'm Tom Gatti, I'm an editor at the New Statesman, and I'm delighted to be here this evening with Deborah Levy. Tonight's event is part of Southbank Centre's London Literature Festival, the longest running celebration of the written and spoken word of its kind in the capital. The festival is running until the 3rd of November, and we hope that you'll join us for some of the other events in the programme too. This evening, though, is devoted to the 2024 New Statesman Goldsmiths Prize Lecture. Briefly, a little background. The Goldsmiths Prize was co-founded by Goldsmiths University and the New Statesman in 2013 to reward fiction that breaks the mould or extends the possibilities of the novel form, I should say. In 2016, we launched an annual lecture inspired by D.H. Lawrence's essay, Why the Novel Matters. And 3 years ago, we brought the series from New Cross to the Southbank, with personal manifestos on the art of fiction from Karl Ove Knausgaard, Helen Oyemi, and now Deborah Levy. It's a real pleasure, as well as an honour, to have Deborah Levy here this evening, because there are few people who have thought and written as illuminatingly on the business of writing and living and the conversation and negotiation between the two. Through her witty, revelatory trilogy of living autobiographies and her brilliantly uncanny novels and plays, Deborah Levy has forged subversive new forms and structures to contain new realities. Literature offers us the chance, if we want it, to create ourselves again, she writes on the jacket of her new book, The Position of Spoons. All the same, she adds, it is sometimes agreeable to just lie in bed and think our own thoughts. And now, the New Statesman Goldsmiths Prize Lecture with Deborah Levy.
Thank you for your warm welcome. The last time I held lots of A4 in my hand was when I was about 23 and I was writing poetry, and we used to read it in pubs, and we were completely unpublished, had a 5-minute slot each, so any time someone had a lot of A4 in their hands, our hearts used to sink. Let yourself go. Pull out from the depths those thoughts that you do not understand and spread them out in the sunlight and know the meaning of them. This is a quote from A Room with a View, E.M. Forster, published in 1908. If the novel is the literary form that offers freedom to speak our minds, I'm not sure it can be written with a closed mind. Clearly, there is something at stake when we ask why the novel matters. But is it so clear? I'm guessing that sometimes we prefer obscurity because it's less painful than clarity. The novel matters because it does not have to be clear or obscure. Yet, in the voyage out between these binaries, between the oil spills, thistles, and phantoms a novel might pass on the way, between desire, disappointment, and the people who clean offices at dawn on page 33, a novel can reach for understanding and re-examine meaning. It is not necessarily comforting to understand something, but I believe it is powerful to struggle into knowledge. We feel the relief and release and elation of a new understanding. This is different from scrolling, skimming, and consuming information, which I do all the time. For a start, the screen does not stare back at us, or love us, or punch us in the face. It is not addicted to us, although we might be addicted to it. How we gaze at the world, which is where all the hard stuff happens, and how we negotiate with the way it gazes back at us, is at the core of all writing. For this reason, the endlessly declared death of the novel, like the death of God, is unlikely to ever happen. To speak in the language of AI, the novel has supreme coding capabilities. One of the tasks of a skilled literary critic is to recognize its patterns. When I start writing a novel, I discover it does have rules, and there is no such thing as freedom, even if the writer is making up the rules. So, for example, in my novel, The Man Who Saw Everything, written from the point of view of Saul Adler, a minor historian who really wants to be a rock star, when we first meet him, aged 28, about to cross the Abbey Road, London, he's reflecting on something his lover said to him. I was thinking about how Jennifer Moreau had told me I was never to describe her beauty, not to her or to anyone else. When I asked her why I was silenced in this way, she said, because you only have old words to describe me. So given this novel is written in the first person, from Saul's point of view, this meant that I'd set this rule through the whole book on page 1. Jennifer Moreau is more or less never physically described by Saul. He has to listen to her or not, has to create her with her own words, her gaze, what she's looking at and why, her actions, her decisions in life, what she risks, her preoccupations, and his feelings for her rather than her feelings for him are center stage. It was a rule that was difficult, but much more interesting than, say, describing her piercing brown eyes. An example of making up the rules is the attitude to grammar that a writer such as Gertrude Stein developed in much of her work. She believed that everyone knows when something is a question, so she erased question marks from her baffling and beguiling writing. Stein also thought commas were servile and that readers should take a breath any time they liked. These were her rules, and with them she asked some very pertinent questions. What does literature do, and how does it do it? And what does English literature do, and how does it do it? If it describes what it sees, how does it do it? If it describes what it knows, how does it do it? And what is the difference between what it sees and what it knows? And then, too, there is what it feels, and then also there is what it hopes and wishes. That's from her lectures in America. So obviously all question marks had left the building and were smoking outside. I'm going to read a short paragraph from an essay in my new collection of writing called The Psychopathology of a Writing Life. Fiction is a good home for the reach of the human mind. It can give shelter to all the dimensions of consciousness, including the unconscious. If the writer is hospitable to this idea, and if the task interests us enough, we will find our own literary strategies to build our homes. Consciousness, in this regard, does not mean streams of consciousness, but rather the consciousness of the entire novel. This composition will have its very own particular writing behavior. A novel matters to me when I am seduced by its language. The material from which a novel is made is language, so why would it be any other way? If its language is dull and dulling, it's hard to become interested in what is at stake for its arguments, its protagonists, or its experiments with form, or to care about its political opinions, even if I might agree with them. The novel matters to me because language gives me pleasure and purpose. I like working with it, listening to it. Language is so powerful, it can sometimes frighten me. Here's a quote from No Violet Bulawayo's wonderful novel, Glory. Words not only mattered, but they were power. Words were muti. Words were weapons. Words were magic. Words were church. Words were wealth. Words were life. So that proverb that children of my generation were encouraged to learn off by heart, to see off bullies in the school playground, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me, was so obviously untrue. I remember being told this at the age of 7 and totally feeling the lie, because it meant that words had no power. So why bother with them? A novel matters when, in the words of Baudelaire, the writer has gone everywhere in the quest for the fleeting forms of beauty in the life of our day. A fleeting form of beauty can be the kindness in someone's hands, a swan flipping upside down to search for fish in a canal full of shopping trolleys, or when a person who appears to be very demure and very mindful suddenly reveals a great talent for taking down the idea that human desire means male desire. I believe we become more interesting to ourselves when we are attentive to writing that matters to us. We have seen and felt things through the eyes of others, and this changes the expression in our own eyes. As George Orwell discovered when he was required to step into the persona of a colonial policeman in Burma, the imperialist wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. It is such a moment in life and in the novel when the mask slips. So much can happen between a writer and a reader. It is a peculiar relationship, this transmission of thought between strangers. Writing and reading, like all relationships, requires solitude, attention, and time. But more provocatively, as Calvino suggests, when we begin to read a novel for the first time, it involves, and I quote, confronting something and not quite knowing yet what it is. I believe this kind of confrontation is worth defending. It is sometimes hard to nail why a novel connects with us. After all, if we could entirely explain this away, it probably would not still be so lively within us. I'm not making a case against critical thinking or theoretical sophistication, but I reckon it's impossible to precisely describe existential truths glimpsed within, say, a Mark Rothko painting, and that is a measure of its success. As Iris Murdoch suggested in her collection of essays on philosophy and literature, Existentialists and Mystics, to be a human being is to know more than one can prove, to conceive of a reality which goes beyond the facts. If I write to find out something I don't know, I have come to believe that the unconscious of the novel does know, it has gone beyond the facts and is adjusting the headlights for the long drive ahead. A novel can drill into the facts of lived experience and come out the other side to somewhere the author never expected to land, if it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. It's possible readers will stand alongside her to gaze at the view. Perhaps it's the only mystery about writing novels, which mostly requires stamina. No, there are other mysteries. Why not? Are we obliged to wear sensible shoes and eat all our vegetables when we discuss why the novel matters? Just as an object might hold some kind of emotional charge for us, the novels that excite me possess that same charge. My own objects include 2 horses that dance when I pull the tails up, and a paperweight with a jellyfish blown from glass floating inside it. They have turned up one way or another in my novels, yet the horses were sold to me as toys, and the paperweight rests on my household bills. That the jellyfish floated into literature and metamorphosed into the Medusa, and that her sting and venom were reconfigured as empowering rather than destructive, is somewhat mysterious. Yet it's not as foolish as war or demolishing a water well. I believe the novel relies on the imaginative participation of its readers, in much the same way Marcel Duchamp believed the spectator completes a work of art. This synergy is also worth defending. Even a novel that deconstructs the novel, requires its readers to step into a voice, a mood, ideas, melancholy, desires, perhaps fury, that might be nothing like our own. The ways in which we encounter familiarity and difference in life and in literature is not a small matter, and Neil Mukherjee's recent novel, Choice, gives us a very astute airing. I believe that we create Anna Karenina and Jane Eyre in parallel with Tolstoy and Bronte, just as we do with the protagonists of novels as aesthetically different as James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room and Alain Robbe-Grier's Jealousy. So Robbe-Grier might not have named the invisible narrator who obsessively observes his wife and neighbors on the tropical banana plantation in which the novel is set, but I have definitely dressed him in a sweat-soaked white shirt that has a slightly grubby collar. As for Mrs. Dalloway, I see her alone in her party dress, smoking a cigarette, trying to unhear the dread in her own mind for years after the novel has ended. The novels that travel with us for a lifetime endure because they have imagined something that is truthful and real. I was always encouraged that a cerebral novelist, such as J.G. Ballard, called himself an imaginative writer. But it is Ursula Le Guin who put it most usefully. My imagination makes me human and makes me a fool. It gives me all the world and exiles me from it. I also very much liked Ballard's small manifestos, and the one that I found most encouraging as a beginner writer went something like, I believe in the beauty of all women, the treachery of their imaginations, so close to my heart. And I thought, well, thank you, Jim. I'll begin. And what about pleasure? It is indeed a pleasure to sit upstairs on a bus in London while snow falls on Tesco Express by the roundabout, open the book that rests on my lap, and find myself in the company of Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles. Here's a short extract. "True enough," said Mrs. Copperfield, bringing her fist down on the table and looking very mean. "I have gone to pieces, which is a thing I've wanted to do for years. I know I am as guilty as I can be, but I have my happiness, which I guard like a wolf. And I have authority now, and a certain amount of daring, which, if you remember correctly, I never had before." Yes, it is wise to guard one's happiness like a wolf when reading a novel on a bus that stops for 20 minutes to even out the service. And what about escape? Bring it on. Novels that matter to me tend to be in conversation with each other. Sometimes they become family, with the benefit of never finishing the last spoonful of peanut butter. I have come to believe that I want contradictory things from a novel, to recognize some of my own preoccupations, yet also to escape from them, to be intellectually engaged, yet emotionally devastated, to be comforted by its continuity, yet invigorated when it is interrupted, such as in Wolfe's To the Lighthouse, in which a decade is compressed into a few breathtaking pages. I want to be immersed in its story, yet not to be relentlessly told that I'm being told a story, or that stories are good for my well-being and the mental health of all of humanity. I want intimacy, distance, enigma, coherence. I want there to be something important at stake. That's what I'm reading for. I long to read novels that I can't put down, and I'm receptive to being dragged into despair. The novel matters because what it is required to deliver is probably impossible. The books I read at 14 were mostly borrowed from the library: Colette, Tolstoy, Zora Neale Hurston, Austen, Scott Fitzgerald, Lawrence Joyce, the Brontes, Garcia Marquez. The delight of reading was enhanced by the 2 pink sugar foam shrimps I purchased on Fridays from the pick and mix at the local newsagent. Sometimes I swapped the shrimps for 3 sherbet flying saucers. The big bang of that teenage reading in the suburbs of London stays with me, particularly Camus' 1942 novel, The Stranger. It was as if that great rush of anger had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and gazing up at the dark sky spangled with signs and stars, for the first time, I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe. As a Bowie fan, I also hoped that Ziggy Stardust would fall from the dark spangled sky to lift me away from the indifferent suburbs to a more glamorous life. Some of the straight white boys at school were reading Jack Kerouac and lent me On the Road and Lonesome Traveller. The nearest I got to being on the road was the route to school down the Finchley Road, so it was quite exciting to travel with Kerouac. And while I read my mother's copy of Edna O'Brien's The Country Girls, I was also keeping an ear out for the landline to ring in the hallway. It had a long, curly cord, a circular dial, and a heavy receiver. I had to make sure I got to it first, so that my best friend did not have to get past my family to get to me. We were all the gatekeepers of each other's calls. Sometimes, when a new, bold novel full of innovation lands in the hands of a gatekeeper who declines to publish it, I believe this person hears the call through the receiver of a telephone from another age. Where's the plot, the story, the narrative arc? Why hasn't a formidable housekeeper with a dodgy eye entered the novel, carrying a tureen of hearty soup and a crusty loaf? Yet, what is coming through the vintage receiver are the beautiful languages and forms of our own century. I'm thinking of the new cadence and startling points of view in Pond by Claire Louise Bennett, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Emma McBride, Assembly by Natasha Brown. It is the historic fate of this kind of gatekeeper to retire to the English countryside. On Mondays, he will warm a sausage roll in the microwave. On Thursdays, he will deliver a lecture to the delicate, crazy wildflowers in his garden. His subject will be something to do with how modernism is a silly continental experiment that refuses to go away. His audience of wildflowers will listen for a while and then talk amongst themselves about their lecherous desire for more sunlight. If they have the energy, they will quote to him a line from Lisa Robertson's incredible novel, The Baudelaire Fractal. Quote, I'm 57 years old. I'm thinking about the immense silent legend of any girl's life. The gatekeeper, who is also 57 years old, has never thought of any girl's life as a life. In the novel, the characters can do nothing but live. So wrote D.H. Lawrence in his 1925 essay, Why the Novel Matters. I agree with Lawrence, which makes a change. If a writer doesn't believe in character, someone or something is doing the living. If they are dying, they are still living, and if they feel dead inside, they are still living, and if they are literally dead, they tend to haunt the mind of the living. Furthermore, these avatars or characters or personae have a body with all its turbulence. When James Baldwin walks the bodies of his African-American protagonists into his novels, they walk into violence and are wounded. The violence is racism and homophobia. The novel matters because from this collective wound, Baldwin made a scalding critique of immense complexity, lucidity, and coherence. Never mind what it means to be a character. What does it mean to be a subject? The British psychoanalyst and pediatrician Donald Winnicott asked himself what made life worth living for the children he worked with so patiently and skillfully. What is there to live for? There is not one answer to this question, and a novel has many ways of asking it. I appreciate the directness of A Man Asleep by Georges Perec. Quote, it is on a day like this, a little later, a little earlier, that you discover without surprise that something is wrong, that without mincing words, you don't know how to live. And here's the odd thing. It is possible that if we have reason to be invested in this most impossible inquiry, what is there to live for? We will not regard humour or human warmth in the novel as unserious. For a start, it is free and freeing. There are some novels that are dead, even if the characters are relentlessly cheerful, unbearably chatty, and apparently alive. If none of it lives, it's usually because its imitation of life has flattened life, the literary equivalent of canned laughter in old-fashioned radio shows, as if there is a cultural consensus about why we laugh and at whom we are laughing. The novel matters because it can disrupt this consensus. I was born in Africa, grew up in England, and through literature met the writers whose novels gave me many other homes. This is not a sentimental matter. Literature is a much more capacious home than my literal physical home. It was the French author Marguerite Duras who taught me that the stranger dimensions of thought can be fully lived in literature. The story of my life does not exist. There's never any center to it, no path, no line, writes Duras in her 1984 novel, The Lover, translated by the magnificent Barbara Bray. It takes some hard living to realize the truth of letting go of the path. I am attached to the story of the path that runs through my life. Even Hansel and Gretel made a trail of breadcrumbs through the dark forest so they could find their way home. All the same, literature that matters to me is hospitable to the idea that sometimes we must lose a story. This can be harder than creating one. When a novel is interested in the coexistence of immense power and vulnerability in its protagonists, not one without the other, it begins to speak in a voice or voices that I believe to be subversive in every way. It is so flattening to only be spoken to in the registers of strength and certainty. During my father's dying days, he summoned me to his sickbed and requested I find a pen and paper. I believed that at last he was going to express his wishes for his funeral and its various rituals. In fact, he wanted to dictate a menu for the week. It turned out that he was not satisfied with his meals. For Tuesdays, he suggests fish curry, Thursday, lamb chops, Friday, roast chicken. My father was 91 and fatally ill and could only swallow liquids. By the time he reached Saturday, I began to admire his bid to be alive for a whole week, unlikely, and to live imaginatively to the very end. I understood that he was struggling with too much reality, imminent death, and needed a break. I accepted his language and did not pierce it with a literal reply such as, "But you can only swallow liquids." We both knew this anyway. The various ways we negotiate with reality is at the core of all writing and living. In this regard, I'm on side with the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas when he asks this interesting question: what kind of conversation could a totally rational being have with another totally rational being? I am interested in skilled writing that is porous, open, simultaneously rational and irrational, because I believe that's how we are. receptive to the stranger dimensions of discursive thought. Writing that doesn't strain to make something new, but when it does, as it must, it's always because the writer has risked something, found form for a shift from the consensus of what a novel is or what representation is, in much the way the artist Francis Bacon once wrote, "I like, you may say, the glitter and colour that comes from the mouth. And I've always hoped, in a sense, to be able to paint the mouth like Claude Monet painted a sunset."
Deborah, thank you so much. That was such a rich and enjoyable and expansive lecture, and I feel very privileged that we all get to sit and listen to you read it. I should say Deborah and I are going to chat for a little bit up here, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for audience questions at the end. I wanted to start with a phrase you use towards the end of the lecture, which is negotiating with reality, or a negotiation with reality, which seems to me a sort of a theme that you could apply throughout that lecture that we've just heard. What does that phrase mean to you, and in what way is it useful for you in terms of thinking about the novel?
I'm trying to find another way of avoiding genre. Social realism, surrealism, autofiction, fiction. I'm so not interested, because I think it's all writing, and you're going to be negotiating with realities, you could say, across all of them, science fiction as well. So it's just like a kind of quite a strange way of trying to avoid that.
And I think, this is something a lot of readers have picked up in your own work, but if the process of writing is a sort of negotiation with reality, then you, as a writer, I think, have a very strong hand, because you're somehow able to deal in the surreal while not losing sight of the real. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that sort of balancing act.
Yes. Well, you can't subvert a reality unless you create one.
I'd agree with that.
So that's kind of my answer.
Yeah.
So it's a good thing to create one.
You have to create one first.
Yeah.
Before you can.
And then it's interesting. I think I'm kind of interested in the uncanny.
Mm-hmm.
So I write with a quite strange palette in my later novels of realism and the uncanny and everything else. And everything else that goes into novels. The thing about a title, why the novel matters. I decided I would do it when Tom kindly invited me, and that I'd only do it if I didn't write it to please anyone. So you could write "tear it down," but why do that unless you need to? If the book needs you to tear it down, to tear what we understand to be the novel down, that's what you must do. But I don't want to kind of rhapsodize and be exciting like that. My own tastes are very clear. So I wanted to think quite slowly about writing and reading and writing that endures.
I sensed some skepticism in there about the sort of current cult of storytelling as a thing in and of itself. Does the sort of idolization of narrative in the culture irritate you?
I love writing narrative. I really do. And but I think story and the sort of sentimentality around the story stops a lot from happening. It's a bit like being on a cruise ship and never gazing into the sea, and that the cruise ship is story. So although I spend my life involved with story, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it.
Yeah. I think there's a piece in your new book, The Position of Spoons, where you refer to the bullying butt of narrative, wanting to place drawing pins underneath.
Yeah. Yes, because it's just kind of used to sanitize all the kind of in-between moments of doubt, it's sort of Neil Mukherjee's got a very good phrase for it. I heard him in an interview say, "We just don't want narrative as smooth as a banana." It really made me laugh. I thought, no, we don't. But in fact, my books are very plotted, right? So if anything, I'm just interested in techniques for them not to appear that way.
Good answer. I wanted to ask you about this figure of the gatekeeper, who has an obsolete telephone receiver and is perplexed by the lack of a housekeeper carrying a tureen of soup. Can you tell me a bit about your own interactions with this gatekeeper figure and whether they've changed at all in the decades that you've been writing and publishing?
I think it has changed. I mean, I'd be interested to know if you agree with this. So when I wrote Swimming Home, it's well known that it was declined by a big handful of British publishers. One editor said, well, I do kind of like it, but I don't know how it's put together, so I don't know how to take it apart. And I thought, why don't you know how a modernist novel is put together? Because I know how a realist novel is put together. We're in the same business. So it's almost as if a sort of a kind of ignorance, a lack of cultural breadth, is okay. It's not okay. It really isn't okay. So around that time, it was a particularly toxic time, in fact, in publishing, because I believe that readers were way ahead of the publishing scene at that time. Tom McCarthy had written Remainder. He couldn't get it published. Emma McBride had written A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, very difficult. These were books that were being turned down, so it was Tom McCarthy, Deborah Levy, and Emma. All of us, apparently, were no good. And that changed. And how it changed, in some respects, or a symptom of how it was going to change, was the White Review, a journal of literature, political writing and of visual writing. It was started by Jacques Testard, who's the founder of Fitzcarraldo Editions, and the writer and art critic Ben Eastham. And a whole new generation of writers began to write for the White Review. And that was the sort of wind of change coming in. But I have to say that at the time Swimming Home was being declined, there was a theatre director called Jules Wright, the great late Jules Wright, who also ran an art centre in Wapping.
The Wapping.
So she did fashion shows, she worked in the kitchen, she directed libretto, and she directed performance. And she knew I was heartbroken about Swimming Home. And she said to me, look, I'm going to print the first 2 pages. I'm going to have them printed beautifully on these 2 blocks, and they're going to go above the door as people pass into an exhibition. The exhibition was called The Death Drive, and it was by Dean Rogers. And Jules was a very brusque person. She commissioned me to write for her every year. She never ever said she liked or hated anything. She just, if she was going to take it, she'd go, yeah. And she put it up, and then she called me and she said, I'm taking it down. And I said, why? And she said, because it's stopping the traffic. So it was true that people were stopping to read that, and that was another sort of, that was also the breeze coming through, a kind of change. So the good thing is that things do change. Really conservative, dusty, fusty times change.
And I think it was that climate, that period that you've identified that was partly what provoked Tim Parnell, gave Tim Parnell the idea to set up the Goldsmiths Prize as well. And of course, the first Goldsmiths Prize went to Eamon McBride.
It did.
As a half-form
well
thing.
done, Goldsmiths Prize. Very necessary
a good
prize.
shout, I think.
Yeah.
We can all agree. The Gatekeeper with his telephone receiver
and sausage rolls.
And sausage rolls. Let's not forget the sausage rolls. Warming. Obviously, just to pick up on that technology metaphor, because the equivalent to the telephone receiver these days is to be found on our screens, of course, and you bring that into the lecture as well. Do you as a writer feel you want to or need to engage with the way that language is being shaped by the internet?
I want to engage, actually, with the way language is shaped by everything. So I would never ignore it. I mean, why would I? So I'm not quite sure how it kind of travels into my work, but I think WhatsApp's very interesting, really interesting, and you could write a whole novel from some of WhatsApp. Why would you have a lofty attitude to everything that is language?
Well, I think that sort of sense that nothing should be off limits, it very much comes through. In fact, that kind of, it's really striking that where you lay out the demands that we place on the novel, how sort of extensive and contradictory they are. When you think about it like that, it sort of strikes me as remarkable that any novel gets written and that they sort of deliver on even a fraction of those. I suppose that makes me think, is there something uniquely capacious about this form that allows it to even get close to meeting this sort of impossible brief?
Yes. I mean, it does meet the brief, if we're lucky. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any books on our on our shelves. I do think it offers the freedom to repeat myself, to make a kind of perceptual shift from the consensus. So the form is the truth of a book. And I think it would be wrong to really strain to make something new. But I've kind of said that if you when you strike on something that is totally new to yourself, to the writer, you smell the smoke, and suddenly the sun comes out, even though it's raining outside, kind of thing. There's in here. I didn't read this out because I thought we were going over time. If I am an avant-garde writer and want my work to be appreciated for the beauty of its formal innovation, it would be an innovation to accelerate high emotion rather than avoid it completely for fear it will stain my shirt. If you are a sentimental writer, it would be an innovation. Let's just take this off. It would be an innovation to read some difficult theory and have no character feel anything at all until you figure out what is being felt. It is a writing adventure to go in deep, then deeper, and then to play with surface, so that we become experts at surface and depth. It is possible to have a preference for the shallows or a preference for the depths, but I reckon they coexist. Anyway, in life, no one I know is entirely stupid or entirely clever.
There's so many writers that we could pick up on. So many reference points in that lecture, but because we bonded talking about music, and I feel contractually obliged to chat to you about David Bowie every time we speak, and you've given me the perfect in, because he does indeed. I thought, is David Bowie going to appear? And there he is. I think you've said before that Bowie actually, you mentioned in the lecture that he gave you an idea of escape, but he also taught you something as a writer, didn't he?
What was that?
When you started writing novels, I think Bowie's sense of persona and character kind of filtered into your writing, no?
That's so true, Tom. Yes.
I'm bookable for any Deborah Levy sort of stand-in events if she can't make it. I'm willing and available.
Tom is an incredible editor, and when he commissions a copy from me, he usually wants it like at the end of the day, and I say no, maybe 5 days, and we have to negotiate with reality and come up with something. Yes, it was. I mean, to invent Ziggy Stardust was an incredible innovation. And as far as I'm concerned, Ziggy's still alive and well and hasn't left the building. I mean, I often think about what it was like to have to assassinate that persona for Bowie. I mean, he's written about it, he's spoken about it, but I still think about it, to sort of retire like a replicant in Blade Runner. That persona is so interesting, and I don't think I've finished writing about that. And maybe like 2,000 words by tomorrow night.
Absolutely, just as soon as you can. I'm glad you haven't finished writing about that. And we can continue that conversation. The other person that I thought I might pick you up on is Baldwin, James Baldwin. I was very struck by what you said about his critique and the question of what's it mean to be a subject. And you know, we were talking earlier that his work seems to have a particular relevance now. I wonder if you could say something about reading Baldwin now in this particular moment.
I don't see how he could never not be relevant, actually. Mostly his essays, and Baldwin's essays were a big influence on my trilogy, The Living Autobiography, because of the way that he made nothing simple. The complexity of Baldwin's in Baldwin's essays, more so actually than in the novels for me, although I have them all and have read them all. Like Fanon, he walks his body right into the center of his inquiry, and so that's, you know, when you have a title like "No One Knows My Name," so that's a very important title. He and Orwell are huge influences, and Don DeLillo. Of the new novels, contemporary novels, I like Adam Thirlwell's Future, Neil Mukherjee's Choice. I think Rachel Cusk's Parade is really interesting.
I hear the sound of recommendations being scribbled down.
Yeah.
So perhaps this is a good moment to open out to the audience. And we have one or two roving mics. I will try and see you as best I can. So if we could have some hands up, and I might try and take two questions at a time, if that works. So could we have at the front here, 4 rows back, with your hand up there? Thank you.
Thank you. That you liked experiencing emotional devastation. I think you've really nailed it for me. That's what I've experienced.
Yes.
I read it over the past week, and I thought it was the events in my life that were making me feel emotional devastation. But actually, hearing you tonight, I understand what I felt. That is both devastating but also extremely life-enhancing in some way. Can I just ask you, why do you like emotional devastation? I'm trying to figure it out myself, and why is the novel particularly important for experiencing that as a human being?
Okay, thanks so much. We'll take one more and then we'll come back to that. So right in the middle there, with the glasses in the middle and the shirt. Yes.
Would you hand that?
Thank you. I seem to know a lot of people who don't read fiction. They only read nonfiction. What would you say to them they're missing out on, and how would you persuade them, if indeed you would try to get into novels?
That's such an interesting question, both. Did you finish hot milk on the way here, did you say? Yes, well, that's a lovely thought to take home. You're walking across the bridge and finishing a hot milk. Yeah, because there has to be quite a lot at stake to keep me on the bus, to keep me interested. And it's not a lie, there is so much at stake in life and in the human relationships in that book. I often thought the language was really quite odd in that book while I was writing it. My mother's love is like an axe it cuts very deep. I remember writing that line, and it somehow then helped me plot the whole book. I guess also there is this idea that if you write, if you're an avant-garde writer, that somehow emotion soils your shirt. And that always annoyed me. I could see an in there for myself, that we can do both. So, you know, if you have a stiff upper lip, the lower lip is always trembling. The question about what does a novel deliver that an essay or non-fiction doesn't, that interests me, because I think that the borders of the two forms are crossing now more and more. I guess that the novel offers me a kind of immersion that it's not that non-fiction doesn't, and I read a lot of non-fiction. I like to be I sort of feel more involved in the fiction than I do in non-fiction. That there's something more at stake. That there's an outcome that I don't know. Whereas in fiction, I can kind of see where the arguments are going to go, even if they're very kind of innovative arguments. And then so much of fiction, and I know you could say this about non-fiction as well. So to write a book, you know, the books on my shelves aren't just novels. There's a fair amount of poetry and psychoanalytic theory and theory of all kind, and books on wildflowers and the skeletal system, and really weird stuff, because I need to know so much to write a novel. And your question would kind of speak to, well, why? And honestly, I think we're just going to have to not answer that directly. Well, strange enough, what comes to mind is Georges Simenon, the Maigret books. And in one of them, there's a murder case, and the cops say to Chief Inspector Maigret, well, what do you think about this case, Chief? And his reply is, I don't think. I was quite interested in that. And what I take from it is that forensics and the autopsy do the basic work, and Chief does something more intuitively mysterious. And that's the case I would make for the novel.
Great, thank you. Can we have two more? There's one third row from the front in the middle there with the long hair, hands up. And then you two might have to fight each other. Could we have the one closest to the microphone first down here? So yes, we're going to take this question first. Sorry, we're going to take this question first. So we'll take yours. We'll take yours after. We've just switched the order just to keep things lively. Okay.
I'm interested in what you were saying about finding a home in literature in a very real and concrete sense, and the connection between that and balancing, renegotiating reality, as we've spoken of, but also balancing sort of the real and the surreal in writing. Because I think you see a lot of writers sort of when you create the reality, as you were saying, in literature, and how that can connect to finding the home in literature as a reader, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. So then can we just take this question in the middle from the lady with the long hair? Hands up. Thank you.
Hello, sorry, that felt like the Hunger Games. So I mainly write poetry, and I find that there's something inherently ephemeral about poetry, i.e., once the words are down on the page, they kind of leave me. So I'm interested to know, to what extent do your novels stay with you, either when they're finished or when they're published?
Yeah, sort of, do you mean kind of linger on and you can't quite let it go? And yeah, there's always that feeling of terrible flatness and elation together when I finish a book. You know, in that moment when you drag the file into the email to send it, and you're shattered, and you know that you've taken it as far as you can possibly take it. So you have, you know, you've been reaching for these ideas and embodying those ideas, and for at least 2 years. As a poet, you'll know this. You know, you've been listening to its cadence and its rhythm, and there will always be something you can't get right, or actually, it's not that you can't get it right. It's just not good enough, and you think, well, I can't go any further with this. I can't reach it. That's the sort of horror of the end of a book. Oh, those 3 lines on page 92, I can't get them right. And then it comes back, and somehow you can get them right, or less wrong. So when you finish a novel, it sort of goes on. You know, everything doesn't just stop. It goes on and on. But that moment, I think that you're talking about, you know, do you still live with those books? And I think I do. I talk to other writers about it, and they say they don't so much. But I think all my books are in conversation with each other, and I think even my book of collected writing is in conversation with the books that I've written since writing some of the pieces in it. So I like this idea of a continuing conversation. It's not that you write the same book, but the conversation continues. And I feel that about Virginia Woolf. Somehow, that all her books are sort of continuing a conversation that she. When there's nothing else to say, I guess there are no more books. When the conversation finishes, you know.
And the other question was about this idea of finding a home in literature.
Yeah, I mean, I thought. Yes, that's what I want to do. That's the place I want to be in. And then if you're talking about it less literally, I mean, Madame Bovary, I don't think I could have written the trilogy without having read Madame Bovary quite a few times, decades before I wrote the trilogy. So every single book on my shelf is like a home. I go into it, I look at how it's built, I look at its design and how it makes me feel, and what it's helped me understand or misunderstand. It's a continuing conversation. It's a sort of home that I keep, the homes maybe that I keep adding extensions to.
I think we can just about squeeze one more in. So we did have this question down here for this person down here, 4 rows from the back, who was early in. So yeah, put your hand up so you can see.
Gosh, this is a lot, isn't it? And I'm here alone, so it feels very much like I'm talking to the entire audience, which I think is what's happening. I read The Cost of Living. Well, I'd actually been reading it over a number of years because I'm terrible at reading books in any sort of chronological order, which is kind of defeats the point. But I read it when I was on holiday in Milan, and even though I'm 24 and I'm not in the middle of a divorce, I came home and basically blew my life up after reading that book. Well, I say that. A lot of good things came from blowing my life up. Probably good things, right? Hopefully. Well, I guess we'll find out in 6 months. But ultimately, what I'm trying to say is when you make a big life decision, possibly a risky one, possibly a scandalous one, how do you know that that was what you were meant to do? Or do you just do it anyway?
I can't really answer that question because I don't give advice just in case you take it. So I'm going to shift that question back into literature and say that the lift from life into literature, whether it's fiction or non-fiction or a kind of mash-up of both, is a very exhilarating lift. And sometimes you can't make that lift from life to literature. So the living autobiographies are very selective. It's not whole life at all. Tom, I wondered if I could just, because the title was Negotiating with Reality, I wondered if I could just end with 4 lines from my novel August Blue, because it speaks to the title. I won't say anything about it except that they're 2 women speaking to each other, and one might apparently be the double of the other. I don't want to kind of, no spoilers. We agreed that whatever happened next in the world, we would still rub conditioner into our hair after we washed it and comb it through to the ends. And though we would be interested to see a wolf perched on a lonely mountain, we liked our household animals to betray their savage nature and live with us in our reality, which is not theirs. They would lie in our laps and let us stroke them through waves of virus, wars, drought, and floods. And we would try not to transmit our fear to them.
Deborah will be signing after this event for about an hour. Excitingly, there are early copies of Deborah's new collected writings, The Position of Spoons, so they're available for sale this evening. And also, if you were furiously taking notes, Deborah's lecture will be published in the Christmas edition of the New Statesman, so you'll have to be a little bit patient, but you'll be able to read it on the printed page or on your screen then. Thank you all for coming. It's been a really wonderful evening. And yes, thank you. Deborah Levy, thank you.